Hi, I decided that I would read the history book just because I think it's helpful. Come across a few people who might not understand the Bible as a historical document, and so it's nice to be able to show that these things are recorded not only in the scriptures or the prophecies took place, and you can read about it in history, um, but then it can give you a time date, which is also good, and just a perspective of what was going on. So this is the book that I'm reading from. I tried to look for a date of its printing, but it doesn't have. So it's got a date that it was given in 1907. So to. I'm going to start with the Crucifixion of Christ, and then just give some background to the Roman um, conquest of the south of Britain. And so it's about the siege of Jerusalem. So the Crucifixion of Christ, 33 AD. As the foundation of the Roman Empire was the greatest event in political history of Europe, so the birth of Christ was the most momentous in the spiritual history of the world. Very few of those then living were able to estimate its importance. Certainly, the Romans did not. Though Roman Christianity, in allowance afterwards, became a great power, so it was through Constantine, who was Flavius Valerius Constantinus in 306 to 337. He had a supposed conversion after he saw a sign in the sky of a cross and heard a voice or something that said, "By this conquer." And so the problem with that was, out of that came the Roman Catholic Church. But also, we as born again Christians, we need to test the things according to Scripture. So Jesus didn't come to conquer or fight. So we know that whatever was going in his mind, in Constantine's mind, was contrary to the Scriptures. But he did allow, or Rome accepted Christianity as a religious faith. And this is the thing, if Jesus didn't have so much effect, this wouldn't have happened. And if Jesus didn't exist, that also wouldn't have happened. Okay, so I'm going to continue on. And so, though Roman Christianity and allowance afterwards became a great power, they were at first opposed as rivals and enemies. When Christ was crucified at Jerusalem in the reign of Tiberius, it was after his trial and condemnation by Pontius Pilate, the Roman procurator or governor of Judea. So then the Roman conquest of Britain was in 43 AD. Another striking event in the early Roman Empire was the beginning of the Roman conquest of Britain in the time of Emperor Claudius. Gradually the whole of South Britain became subject to Rome and continued a Roman province with Roman governors and Roman garrisons for nearly 4 centuries. So also, when you travel in the UK, also Portugal, other places in Europe, you can see wherever like Roman baths were built and stuff like that. I think also in Jerusalem, the old city, you can see the Roman roads, these big slabs of very smooth stone that had been placed by the Romans. So I'm going to go on to the siege of Jerusalem. So the central point is the burning of the temples in 70 AD. So the view of the city. I don't know where it is. Oops. Okay, so Jerusalem. Let me find it quickly. In the general aspect of Jerusalem as it was in the time of Christ may be readily realized. Supposing ourselves standing on the Mount Olivet and looking westward, we have right in front the magnificent temple of Herod crowning the steep crest of Moriah with white and gold. So there's a nice little map here, just so you can get some perspective. So Mount of Olives, Mount of Olives is here on this side. Zion would be more on this side here. The new city is outside here. So here's the temple. So there's a particular tower that will be mentioned. Sorry, I can't find it. The Tower of Anatonia, which would be taken. There's the Western Wall where people pray today. Um, okay, to the south, the west, highest of the four hills on which the city lay, towered the rocky Zion, bearing on its shoulders the citadel, the royal palace, and the house of the upper city. Behind the temple and north of Zion was the hill Acra, covered with the terraces and gardens of the lower city, while on the other slope Bethesda and the new city stretched further north towards the open country. The first wall enclosed Zion and part of Moriah, the second included Acra and Bethesda, the third included the new city further north. So this is what the Romans tried to get through. So the revolt of the Jews, the date is 68 AD, so it's after Christ. The aspect of the city had changed but little when 37 years later the Roman eagles gathered around their prey. But during those years, the Jews had been plunging deeper into vice and wretchedness. So remember the scripture that Jesus said in Luke 21:20-21. He says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out of the city enter into it." At last, goaded and outraged, so this is, I'm going on to the Jews again, by insult, they had risen against their Roman masters. The great Vespasian, a general trained in German and British wars, had been sent by Emperor Nero to reduce them to obedience. So there's quite a good like a movie, it's called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire by Nero. I think it's on the BBC. The actor's very good. It's about Nero. You can watch it if you want, but I don't think you can find it on YouTube. So if you just search in Google and then go videos. So Nero, to reduce them to obedience, moving with his legions from Antioch to Ptolemais or Acra. So here's the other map. Here's Acra. So Jerusalem would be here. The Galilee is there. Dead Sea here. Jordan, this side. Okay. Where was I? And he was joined by his son Titus, who brought forces from Egypt. Galilee and Perea were subdued after some delay, and the conqueror, having drawn a circle of forts around Jerusalem, was at Caesarea preparing the last great blow when he heard the news of Nero's death. The army in Palestine proclaimed Vespasian emperor. He hastened to secure Alexandria, the second city in the empire, and having heard while there that the people of Rome were holding feasts in his honor, he set out for Italy. So the siege of Jerusalem was left to his son Titus. The march of Titus. Mustering his forces at Caesarea and dividing them into 3 bands, Titus marched for the doomed city. Arrived there, he fortified 3 camps, one on the north, one on the west, one garrisoned by the 10th Legion on the Mount of Olives in the east. On the last, the Jews made a sally as the soldiers were digging the trenches, but they were soon beaten down the hill. Within Jerusalem, the scene was a pitiable one of murder and outrage and cruel terror. Robbers calling themselves zealots had flocked in from the country. Eleazar, at the head of one set of these, held the inner court of the temple. Another leader of ruffians named John, occupying ground somewhat lower, poured constant showers of darts and stones into the holy house, often killing priests and worshippers as they stood at the altar. In despair, the people of Jerusalem called in a third robber named Simon to their aid, and thus there were 3 hostile factions within the walls. So there was fighting within. In the fighting that occurred within the city, many houses were burned, and as much corn was destroyed as would have sufficed for a siege of many days. The number of people in Jerusalem was very great, as the feast of the Passover was at hand, and thousands crowded from every corner of the land to offer up their yearly sacrifice. When the temple was thrown open on the day of the feast, a number of John's parties, mingling in disguise with the throng and carrying weapons under their clothes, gained entrance into the sacred court and soon drove out their foes. The poor worshippers, all trampled and bleeding, escaped as best they could. John remained master of the temple, and thus the 3 factions were reduced to 2. Within the city there was above 23,000 fighting men, a strong body if they had been united. There was indeed a temporary union when they saw the Roman soldiers busy cutting down all the trees in the suburbs, rolling the trunks together and dragging to the top of the banks. Thus formed the huge siege engines of the time, rams, catapults, and ballistas. So you can see there what they used. And then it says opening the siege, April 70 AD. The siege opened in 3 places at once in the beginning of April. The Roman missiles poured like hail on the city, but none were so terrible as the stones, sometimes weighing more than 100 pounds, which were cast from the east by the 10th Legion. The Jews replied with some engines planted on the walls by Simon, flung torches at the Roman banks, and made an unavailing sally from the gate in the western wall. 3 towers of heavy timber, covered with thick iron plates, were then erected by Titus, raising higher than the walls and carrying light engines. They were used to drive the Jews from their posts of defense. The fall of one of these at midnight with a loud crash spread alarm through the Roman camp, but it did not last. At dawn the rams were swinging away and pounding against the shaking wall, which on the 15th day of the siege yielded to Neco the conqueror, as the most ponderous of the Roman engines was called by the Jews. The legions pouring through the breach gained the third or outermost wall. Pitching his camp within the city, Titus then attacked the second wall, where he was vigorously met by Simon and by John. Sorties and wall fighting filled up every hour of daylight, and both sides lay by night in their armor, snatching hasty and broken sleep. In 5 days the second wall was forced. Titus passed within it at the head of 1,000 men, but the Jews set on him so hotly in the narrow streets that they soon drove him out again. Easily elated, they exulted greatly in this success, but 4 days later the second wall was taken and levelled with the ground. Then following a pause for 5 days, after which the attack was renewed at John's monument and the Tower of Anatonia. At the same time, Josephus, a noble Jew from whose graphic history the sketch is drawn, went to the walls, as he had done before, as he did oftener than once again, to plead with his countrymen, but all in vain, for the zealots were bent on holding out, and slew such of the people as they found trying to desert. Famine in the city. Famine had long before begun its deadly work. Mothers were already snatching the morsels from their children's lips, and robbers broke open every shut door in search of food, and tortured most horribly all who were thought to have hidden store. Gaunt men who had crept beyond the walls by night to gather a few wild herbs were often robbed of the handful of green leaves for which they had risked their lives. Yet in spite of this, the starving people went out into the valleys in such numbers that the Romans caught them, and at a rate of 500 a day, and crucified them before the walls, until there was no room to plant and no wood to make another cross. The Romans then raised 4 great banks against the wall, but these were all destroyed, 2 by John, who dug a mine below them and set them on fire, and the other 2 by 3 brave Jews who rushed out on the engines, torch in hand. The Romans were driven to their camp, but the guard at the gate stood firm, and Titus, taking the Jews in flank, compelled them to retreat. Capture of the Tower of Anatonia. This serious loss made Titus resolve to hem in the city with a wall. It was built in an amazingly short time of 3 days. The attack was then directed against the Tower of Anatonia, which stood at the northwest corner of the temple, on a slippery rock about 100 feet high. 4 new banks were raised. Some Roman soldiers, creeping in with their shields above their heads, loosened 4 of the foundation stones, and the walls, battered all day, fell suddenly in the night. So I was in the reserve the other day, and I saw a little tortoise. He got a little bit burned from the fires on his nose, on his front legs. But I saw in a little brief video how the Romans put their shields above their heads, and the ones in the front, and they put it in front, and they march forward like that. And they call it the tortoise. So they create like a shell around them. Then it says, but there was Another wall inside, a little dark Syrian soldier led a forlorn hope of 11 men up to this in broad noonday, gained the top and put the Jews to flight. But tripping over a stone he was killed, as were 3 of his band. A night or two after, 16 Romans stole up the wall, slew the guards, and blew a startling trumpet blast. The Jews fled. Titus and his men, swarming up the ruined wall, dashed at the entrance of the temple, where for 10 hours a bloody fight raged. Julian, a centurion, attacking the Jews single-handedly, drove them to the inner court, but the sharp nails in his shoes having caused them to fall on the marble floor, they turned back and slew him with many wounds. Then, following up their success, they drove the Romans out of the temple, but not from the Tower of Anatonia. Strange omens foretold the coming doom. A star shaped like a sword had hung for a year over the city. A brazen gate of the inner court, which 20 men could hardly move, had swung back on its hinges of itself. Shadows resembling chariots and soldiers attacking a city had appeared in the sky one evening before sunset. At Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court, they heard murmuring voices as of a great crowd saying, "Let us go hence." After the Roman wall was built, the famine and the plague grew worse. Young men dropped dead in the streets. Piles of decaying corpses filled the lanes. Thousands of dead bodies were thrown over the walls. No herbs could be got. Men in the rage of hunger gnawed their shoes, the leather of their shields, and even wisps of hay. Robbers with wolfish eyes ransacked every dwelling. And one day they came clamoring for food to the house of Mary, the daughter of Eleazar. She set before them the roasted flesh of her own infant son. Brutal and rabid though they were, they fled in horror from that house of that wretched mother. Burning of the temple, August. At last the daily sacrifice ceased to be offered. So the prophecy of Daniel mentions the ceasing of the burnt offering. And the fighting closed around the temple. The cloisters were soon burned. 6 days' battering had no effect on the great gates. Fire alone could clear a path for the eagles. A day was fixed for the grand assault, but on the evening before, when the Romans had penetrated as far as the holy house, a soldier climbing on the shoulder of another thrust a blazing torch into one of the windows of the north side. So there's a mix of account here, if it was a torch or an arrow. The building was soon a sheet of flame. Titus, who had always desired to save the temple, came running from his tent and ordered the fire to be extinguished. But his voice was drowned out by the din of war and the roar of flames. On over the smoking cloisters trampled the legions, eager for plunder. The Jews sank in heaps of dead and dying around the altar